Carroll Historical Library. I want to welcome everybody here this evening to the talk and the book signing by Professor Jeff Forret. It's with great pleasure to introduce Jeff, of course, and his book, of course, The Price They Paid, Slavery, Shipwrecks, and Reparations Before the Civil War. I also want to thank also the Center for History, Culture of Southeast Texas and the Upper Gulf Coast, and Jimmy Bryant for hosting it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let Jimmy give a few comments, and then we'll turn it over to the speaker tonight. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming out this evening. Thanks to the Carroll Library, Bill Grace, and Linda Tuhan, LaCour, and the entire staff here. This is our second partnership for bringing a presentation to downtown Beaumont. And we're looking forward to future partnerships. I just wanted to say a few words about the Center for History and Culture of Southeast Texas and the Upper Gulf Coast. I apologize for the long name. I didn't come up with it. If anybody here is working on projects, research, creative projects that are related to Southeast Texas and the greater Gulf region, our fellowship deadline is March 15th, so it's coming up. I got some more information over here on our information table. Have a look, talk to me about it afterwards. It's a fellowship of up to $5,000 to support your research or creative activity. I would like to take a moment to tell you about some upcoming program that we have this semester. Next, in a couple weeks after our spring break, on Thursday, March the 20th, the center is working with a couple other groups on campus for a program called Lamar's First Gen Perspectives. And then again, this is Thursday, March 30th. This will be in the Setzer Center, Sabine Room number 208. This will be at 5 o'clock. There will be refreshments being open to the public. And essentially, it's going to be a panel of alumni, current students, and faculty who are first generation, like I am. And I believe several of us here are also first generation college students, to talk about the unique circumstances that they face when they come to school. So we're looking forward to that program. There'll be refreshments available, so come out for that. Also, the center will be hosting its Greater Gulf Symposium at the end of the month on March 31st and April the 1st. On April the 1st, which is a Tuesday, we'll have our public event. This will be a keynote speaker, Carrie Helms-Tippin from Chapman University. We'll be talking about Southern cookbooks. The theme, come on in. The theme for this year's symposium is the foodways of the Greater Gulf. And at this keynote, we'll have a reception, so there'll be plenty of food provided by the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you, Dean Boone, for that, as well as a poster session. So we welcome any and all to come out and talk about food. So if you want any more information about the center, we have our table there. Take a brochure. There's a QR code so you can log into our events page at the Lamar University website. So let me just say a few words about our speaker, Dr. Jeff Forret, award-winning author and scholar. Just to mention a couple, university professor in 2023, the Ralph and Edna Wooster Professor of History of the History Department in 23-24, Lamar Distinguished Faculty Research Fellow. There are others. He's also the author of Williams Game, a notorious slave trader and his cargo of black convicts, which came out in 2020. Slave Against Slave, Plantation Violence of the Old South, which came out in 2015 and won the prestigious Frederick Douglass Book Prize, which is the main award for Dr. Forret's field. But I'm sure he's most proud of the award of serving as our assistant director this year. So thank you very much. His current monograph, The Price They Paid, Slavery, Shipwrecks, and Reparations Before the Civil War, just come out, and that's what he's here to talk to us about today. So, Dr. Forret.
All right. I got my clock up here so I don't go over. Jimmy says he's going to bring the guillotine down at 25 minutes. All right. First of all, thanks to Jimmy and the Center for History and Culture, everyone here at the library, and for all of you for coming out. This is my latest book, The Price They Paid. Came out on November 19th of 2024. And it's basically a book about four coastwise domestic slave trading ships. We often think of the domestic slave trade as being, an overland phenomenon with enslaved people chained together 2 by 2 in coffles, making a very long walk to places farther south and west. But there was also an active coastwise domestic slave trade in which enslaved people would be loaded on ships in places like Baltimore or Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, and sent to places farther south, whether it was, Charleston, a relatively short trip, or, Mobile, or most likely New Orleans, which was the largest slave trading center in all of North America. I'm looking at really four particular domestic slave trading vessels here, the Comet, Encomium, Enterprise, and Hermosa. And the reason that I picked those four is because in each case, something went awry with these voyages, and the slave ships in each case ended up in a British colonial Atlantic holding. 3 of them ended up shipwrecked in the Bahamas, and 1 of them got blown off course to Bermuda. And in each of these cases, the British government and their representatives in the colonies allowed the enslaved people from aboard these slave ships to choose their freedom if they elected to do so. And as a consequence of all that, if you add up the 4 main voyages that I talk about here, more than 300 people ended up escaping slavery due to a maritime misfortune as far as the captain was concerned. Quite good fortune for them. And I did add the voyage of the Creole here at the bottom. I stayed away from the Creole because there are a couple of books written about the Creole already. And if you're not familiar with that one, in 1841 there were 128 enslaved people who ended up conducting a slave rebellion on board a slave ship. And they were successful in this slave revolt, and they ended up, they spared enough of the crew. They told them, take us to the Bahamas. We want to go where these other ships have already gone. So there was news out there. Enslaved people knew that there were slaves who were freed in the Bahamas as a consequence of these incidents. So I didn't feel the need to investigate that one fully, but these 4 voyages are precursors to that Creole incident, which, is arguably one of the more successful slave revolts in Western Hemisphere history. So maybe I'll get into the process a little bit here, especially since I know there's students out there. This book, first of all, I should say, originated in my previous book, Williams Gang. And it was one of those cases where when one door closes, another door opens. My editor with my previous book made me delete two things from Williams' Gang. One was an entire chapter. She said, we really don't need this chapter. So I published that with the Journal of the Early Republic. And then in my introductions, she said, your introduction is one paragraph too long. And that was the paragraph where I had mentioned these voyages. So I said, all right, well, if I can't have my paragraph on these voyages, I'll just do a whole book on it. So that's what I ended up doing. And I mean, it took research in Washington, D.C. and North Carolina, South Carolina, New Orleans, of course. A lot of these ships were destined for New Orleans. But the real fun stuff was all at the British National Archives in Kew. I flew over to England in, I think it was 2019. So it was fortunately pre-COVID. So we could get on a plane in relative comfort. And I went over there and I found at the British National Archives 2 boxes, one of which you see there, of treasury papers. And when I opened each of these boxes, they were cataloged in the sense that we knew there was a box of these 2 boxes of treasury papers. Inside, nothing was processed at all. I opened it up to find what the British were calling tight bundles. And there were all of these wads of paper that were tied together with string. Maybe back in the 1830s and not opened since then. I do not know anybody else who had used these materials. So it's dirty work, what doing real history does. So you have to unfold these tight bundles, and literally, since these had not been opened maybe ever, as far as I could tell, I sometimes had like 3 archivists working with me at the same time, because I am using their material. The archivists like you to use their material, but they were so concerned about the damage that could result. So I had this whole team of people helping me out with the weighted bags and weighted ropes so we could flatten these things out enough so I could read them. Some of these were so old and deteriorated that the ink had actually dried and had begun to settle in the creases. So I had to wipe away some of the dried ink to read the writing that was underneath. So that was the real heart of it. I got all kinds of material from the British perspective on the decision-making process that they are going through to make these decisions regarding the fate of these enslaved people. Then, I also had to go do research in the Bahamas. I know, somebody has to do it, and I am willing to make that sacrifice for the team. And it was such a delightful building, painted in the pink color, very tropical. I did not realize that there was actually at the time travel advisory in place, and Americans were not supposed to leave the resorts. And here I'm at an Airbnb walking like 15 minutes to the archives. And I did think it was really weird when I went into the store and to a couple of different restaurants, there were police officers stationed everywhere at the entrance. I probably should have been smarter about the whole thing, but I was not. So I got the Bahamas side of the story here at the Bahamian National Archives. When that first shipload of enslaved people off the Comet pull into the harbor at Nassau, the British officials in Nassau, they weren't exactly sure the proper course of action to take. So they sent these captives across the water to this place called Hog Island. It was deserted at that point, other than a whole bunch of feral hogs running wild, so that they stored this original batch of 165 enslaved people on Hog Island. Today, if you visit the Bahamas, it's called Paradise Island. It's where all the big hotels are. It was less glamorous back in the 1830s. I was not able to go to Bermuda as I had planned. By that point, COVID had set in. But I was still able to piece together the Bermuda side of the story as well. The Bermuda ship was called the Enterprise. It ends up in Bermuda, blown wildly off course during a series of winter cold fronts that were going across the Atlantic. And the Enterprise contained a number of enslaved people that were being shipped by J.W. Neal and Company out of Washington, D.C. They were being shipped southward to Charleston. But again, the ship got blown off course. But I was able, nonetheless, to find some records from the Enterprise that were still located over in England. This is the slave manifest from the Enterprise's voyage. This is just page 2 of it. And you can see it lists the enslaved people by name. They give their height, their color or complexion, that kind of information. I'm going to zoom in here just a little bit. Number 37 on this list is a young girl of 9 years old named Mary Warfield. This was the trickiest part, the most challenging part of this book, was trying to recover the stories of the enslaved people who ended up being freed, because they generally didn't leave their own records. I do know that one became the chef for the governor of the Bahamas. I do know that one from the first vessel, the Comet, ended up working on salvage vessels and helped rescue people from the next ship that I discovered, on the Encomium. And he said, oh yeah, we've done this before. We got freed when we landed here. So he was giving, some hope to those on the second ship. But I point out Mary Warfield here because she is the one and only of these more than 300 enslaved people who were freed by landing in a British colony that I found a photograph of her. That's Mary Warfield now as an adult, as a grandmother with her grandson. She had a photograph taken with her grandson sometime around 1890. And the wonderful archivists at the National Archives of Bermuda helped me track this thing down. So I'm very grateful to all those folks who were helping during a very difficult time for those of us who were researching our books. So we have all of these enslaved people being freed, making the choice for freedom, taking advantage of the opportunities that the British government has given them. But as one might expect, for U.S. slave owners, that is a significant financial loss to them. Those people were their property, and they all had a dollar figure attached to them. Some of the U.S. slave owners or slave traders who had enslaved people on these vessels had taken the precaution to insure their valuable cargoes. And it was pretty routine, certainly for the slave traders, the professional slave traders, And, even for individuals who were sending enslaved people coastwise to take out insurance policies on them. It's sort of like life insurance. They were insuring the lives of their enslaved property, but it's also a form of insurance that would end as soon as they pulled into port. And there's all the legalese and all the the covered cases that the policy would allow, and then the exclusions, just like we have today. All these U.S. slave owners or their insurance companies, they've lost money here. I mean, the insurance companies do end up sometimes willingly paying out to the slave owners. Sometimes the slave owners had to take them to court, but the courts in every single case found in favor of the owners and against the insurers. Regardless, there are people who are out of money. They have suffered a financial loss that was, significant in some way. They are demanding compensation. They want to be paid back for the loss that they have suffered thanks to the actions of the British Crown. So they immediately go to the U.S. government. And the United States government fully supported these slave owners and the insurance companies in their efforts to secure compensation from the British Crown. They see that the British government is at fault for violating their property rights. The slave owners said that their rights as slave owners did extend to ships on the high seas, and that those rights needed to be respected. Just because they ended up in a British colony didn't mean that British law suddenly applies. So the U.S. government goes to great lengths in diplomatic negotiations to secure recompense from the British Crown. They spoke of it in terms of reparation, singular. That was the language of international affairs, that they wanted to secure reparation from a foreign government. And it didn't matter who was president, if they were from the North or South, who was the Secretary of State, if they were from the North or South, or who the U.S. ambassador to England was, if they were from the North or South. The U.S. government was supportive of these slave owners and their insurance companies, to the point that their efforts lasted more than a couple of decades. These cases that I've identified on the first slide, some of them are not hammered out until 1856. And the United States government has just doggedly, persisted that entire time. One of the big issues at stake, of course, was the fact that slavery was very much still alive and quite well in the American South, whereas it was on the decline and ending over this decade that I'm really focusing on in the 1830s. Great Britain had passed its slavery abolition law in 1833, went into effect in 1834. So that's in the midst of these shipwrecks. And that was one of the points of argument that the United States diplomats could make. When Great Britain freed enslaved people in most of the British Empire in 1834, they compensated the slave owners for the loss of those enslaved people. Britain spent about 20 million pounds in compensation for these slave owners. The British government had to take out loans from the Rothschilds to make these payments to slave owners. Britain finally paid off those loans in 2015. Interest on $20 million adds up. And there was a similar story, with France and Haiti as well. When that slave revolt that created the independent Black Republic of Haiti overthrew their French colonizers, France refused to recognize Haiti's independence until Haiti agreed to compensate French slave owners who had lost their enslaved property. And Haiti is going to be straddled with all of those payments until 1947. So there were certainly precedents for paying other nations when enslaved people were free. So that's what the United States angle is going to be, to try and get compensated for their losses. I don't know that I want to get into the real resolution of all this, because I'd like you to get the book. But long story short, there are a number of these individual cases in the book documenting specifically who these slave owners are and the kinds of things that they are doing to get paid back for the loss of their enslaved property. One was, I talk about John Waddell of North Carolina. He wanted to relocate with his enslaved people to Louisiana. So there is actually kind of a Gulf connection here. But those enslaved people that he was going to put to work on a plantation along the Red River were lost as part of this British, as he would call it, a seizure of his enslaved property. There was another Charleston, South Carolina merchant. He was an Italian immigrant who was doing quite well for himself. He wanted to relocate and start a plantation out west. He loses some enslaved people. And then, of course, we're dealing too with various different slave traders who are losing much larger cargoes as part of their business operations. But the United States government will definitely go to bat for these people. I came in 3 minutes ahead of when you were going to shut me down. So let me go ahead and end it there and ask if you wanted to, have any questions for me. I'm happy to answer those. Otherwise, we'll try and go short and sweet here. I've already taught 2 classes today. Yeah, Ken.
What was the cargo capacity of these ships? You mentioned specific numbers that were...
Yeah, for the ones that I'm looking at, they don't have any more than 165 enslaved people on board. Now, some of the ships, later they get larger. Some slave ships will have, even in the coastwise domestic slave trade, will have, 300 on there. I list the actual tonnage in the book for the ships. But these tend to be, somewhat smaller. And in some cases, too, they're not really slave ships per se. Some of them are just like the ships owned by commission merchants, and slave people just happen to be part of the cargo. But otherwise, they're shipping, tobacco and barrels and things of that nature. But enslaved people are part of the cargo. Yeah, Tina.
Are the slave owners, are they filing claims with their insurance companies and wanting reparation from Great Britain or?
Oh, okay, yeah. The slave owners who get compensated from their insurance companies, they're out of the story then because they got their money. But the insurance companies don't want to suffer that loss. Now, there were some slave owners that did not take the precaution of getting insurance. One of them was Charles Tutt. He was a U.S. naval employee. And he got stationed in Pensacola. And He went down there. He was one of like a handful of naval agents for the U.S. government. I actually have a chapter that deals with his wife because he had already gone to Pensacola. She was to follow, but she wanted to send a small number, I think 9 enslaved people, family slaves, in advance to meet her there because she didn't want to be without her pool of slave labor at her disposal. And her brother was in charge of putting these 9 family slaves on one of these ships that I talk about that ends up wrecking in the Bahamas. So she loses these enslaved people. There's a whole huge court case in Virginia because her brother dies, and there's a big dispute over who owned those slaves at that moment in time. Was it Mary? Was it her husband, Charles? Or was it the brother who had put them on the ship? And this ends up before the Federal District Court in Washington, D.C. Court records ended up being very useful for this. And there's a lot to be learned from her story about sort of gender conventions and where women kind of rate in this slave-owning world. Because she literally was petitioning to get money back from the British Crown because they had not had the foresight to get that insurance policy. And I have a letter from Colonel Tutt complaining about his brother-in-law's carelessness in not taking out an insurance policy. So that's another. Technically, there's diplomacy behind all of this, but I'm still a social historian at heart. So I'm really trying to look at, what are the stories of these slave owners, these enslaved people, these slave traders, to try and bring that more human side out of the story. Yeah.
On the trafficking of slaves, is the Upper South starting to diminish the number of slaves they're bringing in versus, cotton becoming king to the lower?
Yeah, I mean, the domestic slave trade, as a general rule, shifts enslaved people from the Upper South to the Lower, and from the older slave-owning states in the East to the West. That's why, like most of these folks, were eventually, destined to be in New Orleans and be part of the big slave market there. But again, fate intervenes in a beneficial way for them. Rebecca, yeah.
What kind of things did they do once they opted for freedom? I mean, just as a livelihood?
In the Bahamas, where I'm able to document this somewhat better, a lot of the women become domestic servants. There were a number of the men who found maritime livelihoods. Salvage vessels, you could make a career salvaging in the Bahamas because there are so many, reefs and rocks just under the water. There are plenty of people who are making a career that way. Fishing, that sort of thing. As I say, the one becomes the chef to the governor. That's an unusual case. They're harder to track down, certainly. And there was a lot of concern. It was pretty strange. I found a lot of this with the Comet, the first of these ships. The British officials in the Bahamas were interested in giving the enslaved people an opportunity for their liberty. The white population of the Bahamas was very much opposed. They said, put them back, because the ship captain of the first one, Isaac Staples, as soon as he pulled into Nassau, he got a loan from the U.S. consul and bought a new ship and started outfitting it to be a slave ship. And he's ready to put them on board and carry on. And the bulk of the white population in the Bahamas is all for that. They march en masse to complain to the governor of the Bahamas, don't keep these people around here, shove them on, let them go on their way. Because already white people in the Bahamas were a minority population, that this is a majority black population, and their thought was that, their assumption was that these were enslaved Americans. They're going to be troublesome because who are the people who are going to be sold? They're going to be lazy people, criminals, and you'd be unleashing this, terrible population of American slaves on our island. So, keep them on their way. But you did happen to have a British governor in the Bahamas who was an abolitionist at the time. So, and he turned it over to a judge, and the precedents that they had found suggested freedom was the way to go. The Somerset case from the 1770s, always said, if a slave steps foot on British soil, they're free. It wasn't clear if that applied to the colonies also. And they didn't go out and say it that explicitly, but they found other precedents in the British historical past where they thought they would err on the side of freedom, to give enslaved people the chance. Not all of them took it, mind you. That there were a small number of enslaved people who got back on a slave ship and came back to the United States. Tracking them down was basically impossible. There was one, though, that I could see some commentary in the newspapers. There was a woman by the name of Martha Ridgely. And I want to say she was on the Enterprise, the one that ended up in Bermuda. And she and her, was it 5 or 6 children that were on the ship, she made the choice for her and her children that they were going to return to the United States. Now, the newspapers, and again, we got to take this with a grain of salt, the newspapers said that, she had struck up a relationship with the cook on the slave ship, and that she was going to go back to the United States because either he had agreed to, either free her, marry her, something, that she thought she would go back to the United States. Others have suggested that actually she had other kids back in the United States and that maybe she had hopes of reuniting with them. A lot of the enslaved people on the Enterprise that ended up in Bermuda, it's overwhelmingly enslaved children on that vessel, most of whom had been kidnapped by slave traders in the Chesapeake. But she happened to be there with, some number of her children. The newspapers were playing it up like, she had used her sexual wiles, It plays into a lot of stereotypes about, black female sexuality and that kind of thing. In reality, I assume that there was some logical reason that she would make that call, and it was probably related to family. Just because we do know that there are free black people in the United States who voluntarily, re-enslaved themselves so that they could remain with family. That's probably the biggest factor there. But yeah, it's hard tracking all the stuff down with the enslaved people. I did the best I could, but I'm not saying it's great. Ken, did you have another question?
Well, no, that's one.
Okay.
What Rebecca said. Were these cargoes, were all they domestic? None of this was, they had been enslaved in Africa and then brought over?
Yeah, this is all the coastwise domestic slave trade. And in fact, one of the legal requirements, if you were a slave trader pulling out of port on the slave manifest, you had to sign your name to testify that none of these people were brought over illegally, after, 1808. I mean, I guess theoretically some of them could have been here before then, but I didn't get a sense that there was much of an African presence here, much more of an African American presence. Adam.
Yeah, so speaking of reparation and precedents, you talked about how the U.S. government went after this for like decades.
Yes.
Finished prosecuting it. You'd imagine that that precedent made for a very difficult story when the slaves all across the U.S. were emancipated in the Civil War and right before that. It's a little outside your scope, but how do they reconcile this idea that, when slaves are freed by the British Empire, the owners deserve to be paid,
Right.
when they're freed by the American government,
Uh-huh.
then they're not. I mean, again,
Well, I mean, there is one exception to that in Washington, D.C. Those were the only slave owners in the United States to get compensated for the emancipations of their enslaved people. Yeah, this is April of 1862. Congress does free slaves in Washington, D.C. And Congress allotted $1 million for compensation to the slave owners of these enslaved people. The U.S. government hired Bernard Campbell. He was a professional slave trader in Baltimore to review all of the petitions for compensation. And he was going to, check and see, what these people really, should be worth. But there's like 3,000 enslaved people in D.C. alone, and they only got $1 million. So they can only really average a little over $300 per enslaved person. And enslaved people were going for much more than that, in the 1860s. So a lot of people, even among D.C. slave owners, felt very ripped off by the process. They didn't feel any similar need to compensate when the 13th Amendment frees the enslaved people, though. And part of the reason is Andrew Johnson, because Andrew Johnson, president after Lincoln's assassination, he was a profound racist from, Tennessee, and, Lincoln had brought him on just as a display of unity when Lincoln ran for re-election. He was adamant in preserving slave owners' property rights. And when they had a couple of different experiments during the Civil War about confiscating slave owner land and distributing, the 40 acres and a mule to black families, Johnson does away with all of that. He's not even remotely considering any kind of compensation scheme there. And the big difference, of course, is that any compensation scheme that the United States undertakes in 1866 or whatever would be American money, right? It's easy to agitate for compensation when it's not your money, when it's the money that belongs to the British Crown. So, the political will to pursue reparation was much greater given the source of the funds before the Civil War versus after.
All right, let's draw to a conclusion. Thank you very much. Round of applause.